fuzzy.
I know, I don't have a background either. Because we never use Zoom.
We should be playing the theme music, the leadership theme music.
I know I was trying to find it, but I'm worried I don't know how to play music successfully through Zoom yet.
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
Good. We were just saying that it's a shame we don't have the theme music piping in the background.
Yeah, the folk song of ELP lives in infamy among our team. Hey, David. Good to see you.
Likewise. How are you, Raina?
Good. Yeah. Just trucking along with this programmatic update, you know?
Well, I enjoy your very informative newsletters. They're great, compendium of useful information.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that. I know Alicia works a lot on those every month, so it's good to have those be useful.
Well, I like the fact that you positioned them so they can be repurposed and forwarded by related organizations that don't have the research capability you have. So it really is very synergistic.
Yeah, I think it's been really helpful for some of our regional folks to be able to refocus on more business support and less of the admin pieces, you know?
Yep.
Well, it looks like a few people are trickling in, but I think we are good to go to get started here. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us for our first Colorado Green Business Network hosted workshop. We're very excited to have you all here. My name is Alicia and I am a Green Business Specialist with the Colorado Green Business Network. And so for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, the Colorado Green Business Network is a voluntary statewide program that encourages, supports, and rewards businesses for exceptional work innovating sustainability in their daily operations. And so tracking, reducing, and reporting an organization's greenhouse gas emissions is a key component of a business's response to climate change and improve sustainability in operations. So we increasingly see sustainability certifications, commitment campaigns, making use of greenhouse gas inventories. And so the CGBN is also taking part in this as well. So as most of you know, or as you've gone through our application process, our new points-based application system for state certification and recognition has 2 questions based on greenhouse gas inventories. One is based on conducting a greenhouse gas emissions inventory that includes scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions as a benchmark, and then you would measure your reductions against that, and then to assess your baseline carbon intensity as well. And then the second question in our application asks about your most recent calendar year's total greenhouse gas emissions data, as well as focusing on calculated carbon intensity in order to assess reductions. So both of these questions provide an opportunity to gain points based on your organization's greenhouse gas inventory emissions. So to help you better understand and successfully answer these questions in the application and to just get started tracking your organization's emissions more consistently, we have invited Suzanne Gabriel and Betsy McLaughlin from Geosyntech Consultants in Denver to review the basic concepts of these greenhouse gas emission inventories, including those scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. They will also walk through hypothetical situations using emissions calculator tools, which are also included in those questions on our application. And they will also be sharing common pitfalls in getting a greenhouse gas inventory pulled together and ways to overcome those pitfalls. And so Geosyntech has been an active member of our program for many years, and we are so grateful to have them here to support our network today. And so with that, I will hand it over to Suzanne and Betsy. And just to let you guys know as well, there will be a Q&A session at the end of their presentation, but please feel free to ask questions in chat as we go through the presentation, because I'll have them answer those at the end. And I will also be sending out a survey at the end of the presentation as well. So if you could take a couple minutes to fill that out as well, that would be wonderful. So yeah, with that, please welcome Suzanne and Betsy.
Thanks, Alicia. Betsy's driving the slides, right? But I'll kick things off. So, oh, now there's no slides up.
Yeah, I think she has to give me permission.
Okay. I think, yeah, just to elaborate on what Alicia was saying, Geosyntech's been involved with the Colorado Environmental Leadership Program since 2008. You know, we provide a wide range of services, including greenhouse gas emission inventory for clients. We joined the ELP because I'm getting a little feedback.
If everybody could mute their, that'd be great.
I think I have control
yeah.
mute people. Let me,
Yeah, I think
let
that's
me go
how
ahead and do that.
yeah. Yeah, you should be able to mute people. Cool. There we go.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, so as I was saying, we've been involved since 2008. We do, provide services around management system consulting. And when you guys are starting to make commitments relative to greenhouse gas reductions, energy use, waste minimization, just remember that if you had a management system before, it's okay to just continue on with that management system. These are just more compliance obligations that you were already managing, just like you were managing CDPHE rules or your municipal rules. So don't be too freaked out by it. I brought Betsy McLaughlin in because she's an expert at greenhouse gas emissions inventories and advising clients on how to reduce their GHG emissions. And I'm going to turn it over to her.
Okay, great. So here's a little agenda for our presentation today. Suzanne already gave a brief introduction. I'll introduce myself, give a little greenhouse gas overview, talk about building a greenhouse gas inventory, go through some calculation examples, and then kind of go into disclosure and next steps, like what do you do once you have your inventory built? Sorry, I'm like getting waiting room notifications too, so I'm like trying to figure that out.
Hopefully there's an admit all button.
Yes, I did. Okay. I think I'm just going to periodically have to check that to make sure. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I'm Betsy and I have been, I have an environmental engineering degree. And I'm currently working on my master's in mechanical engineering with a focus on clean technology. At Geosyntec, I'm on the energy transition team where I focus on carbon management. I help clients quantify their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as well as performing life cycle analyses. We help clients learn what their emissions mean and where they can find meaningful and potential reduction opportunities. Prior to Geosyntec, I spent 8 years as an air quality specialist in the oil and gas industry, where I worked on air permitting and compliance, greenhouse gas programs, sustainability, and ESG initiatives. And so now on to a quick overview of greenhouse gases. I'll start with the greenhouse gas protocol. The greenhouse gas protocol is the core guidance for creating your inventory. It helps you with defining boundaries, tracking your emissions over time, prioritizing data collection and calculations, calculating and reporting your emissions, and also with setting potential emission targets. They have some supplementary guidance documents out there as well related to scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Their main focus is scope 1. In addition to their overall guidance, they do recommend that individual industries put out their own sector specific guidance using stakeholder involvement. So there's a lot of those supplementary guidances out there for certain industries as well. This graphic illustrates the different categories of emissions. Scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions from your owned and controlled operations. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. And scope 3 emissions are those emissions that result from activities that are not owned or operated by your organization, but are directly impacted in your value chain. Okay, so to build off that, the greenhouse gas protocol covers emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. And here are some illustrated examples that can fall into each scope category. For scope 1, you can have carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions from combustion. You might have methane from landfill gases and methane from various upstream oil and gas processes. Scope 2, you'll have combustion emissions from your purchased electricity or steam. And these emissions actually don't happen at your facility, they happen at the power plant, but you take ownership of them. and they can be allocated to you based on your actual electricity usage and emission factors that are specific to the grid area that you live in or work in. And then the greenhouse gas protocol also outlines 15 different categories of scope 3 emissions. You can see them over here in this illustration. I'm not going to talk about them all, but some common ones that are applicable to people are business travel, employee commuting, and purchase goods and services. Sorry, I'm going to quickly check I keep getting these notifications.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll add that we are going to distribute these slides, and this is being recorded too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now the reason we're here, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of building a greenhouse gas inventory. There are a few key principles that are important when you're beginning to build a successful inventory. Let's start with relevance. You want to ensure that your inventory reflects the greenhouse gas emissions of your company. You want to make sure it's complete and that you're accounting for and reporting on all greenhouse gas emission sources and activities that are within your inventory boundary. And if you exclude any sources, you want to make sure you are documenting and justifying the reasons. Consistency, you want to make sure that you're using consistent methodologies that allow for accurate comparison of emissions over time. You want to make sure that you're transparently documenting any changes to your data, inventory updates, boundary or calculation methodology, pretty much anything that's relevant to your results. You just want to make sure that you're being super transparent, especially when you're publicly reporting these emissions. And then obviously accuracy. You want to make sure that the quantification of your greenhouse gas emissions are as close to your actual emissions as possible and ensure that you're reducing any uncertainties. There are obviously going to be uncertainties. That's, the nature of this stuff, but you want to make sure you're documenting it and just, reducing them the best that you can. So the first step in actually building your inventory is to define your organizational boundaries. I'm not going to talk about all of these details. There's a lot, like Suzanne said, we're going to pass out the slides so you can peruse all of the details, but the gist of it is that you have 3 main boundary approach options when starting your inventory. You have an equity share approach, a financial control approach, and an operational control approach. And when you're choosing your boundary approach, there are a few things that you want to consider. You want to make sure that you're in alignment with any sort of other reporting you do, whether it be financial or environmental, anything like that. You want to make sure that you're taking data availability into account as well. You want to make sure that you're reporting on data that you actually have access to. And you also want to be aware of what other companies are reporting in order to make sure that you're not overlapping. You don't want your boundary to overlap their boundary, and then you guys get a double counting of emissions. So after you've set your organizational boundary, you set your operational boundary, and this defines the scope of your direct and indirect emissions from the operations that fall within your company's organizational boundary. And so this graphic depicts the interaction between potential organization and operational boundaries. You'll kind of see here, you could report as this entire parent company, and then you would have all of these sources. But say your company B, you only want to be reporting for what company B is in charge of, which is a power generation unit and an owned or controlled building. You don't want to be reporting the ship fleet from company A if company A is also reporting that separately, because then you end up with double counting. So, if you're just a little small company, you don't have to run into these nuances, but when you're a bunch of small subsidiaries under a big parent company, it can get a little confusing. Once you have your boundaries set, you're ready to start actually building your inventory. So first, you want to identify the sources that you need to include in this inventory, and then you need to figure out what calculation method you want to use to calculate your emissions. Then you're going to collect any pertinent operational inventory data for each source and determine the correct emission factors that might be applicable to these categories in the data. Then you calculate. So some different emission calculation methodologies I've put on here. You might have direct measurement through monitoring. You might do process simulations and modeling. You might use a mass balance or use emission factors, which are often provided by EPA. And so we're going to go through some example calculations later, and I can go into a little bit more detail about finding emission factors and what kind of data you need to collect for certain sources. So once you have your inventory built, it's important to think about tracking your emissions over time. Companies need to track their emissions over time for a few different reasons. It could be a regulatory requirement for public reporting. It could be for establishing targets and measuring progress towards those reduction targets. It could be managing risk and opportunities, or to address like stakeholder and investor requests. The latter is becoming more and more common. Like we see this constantly with clients that we do help for, like, you know, investor pressure to set targets, build an inventory, and reduce emissions. You're going to want to choose a base year for your inventory when you're setting goals and targets, so that you want that base year to have accurate and complete data and be an accurate and complete inventory. Along with this, you'll want to develop a base year recalculation policy. Potential reasons you might end up wanting to go in and recalculating could be mergers or acquisitions. You know, if you set your goal in 2022 and then in 2025 you acquire a big company, there's a huge, you know, jump in your emissions there that are going to go against your target. So you might want to go back and recalculate your initial inventory, like kind of including those extra emissions. That way you're not completely off your reduction target. You might also have an outsourcing or insourcing of emitting activities. There might have been a major change to the calculation methodologies or improvements in the accuracy of your emission factors. Or even you go back and discover you made a big error in your inventory. Like that happens a lot as you get better at it each year and you realize, oh, wow, like I illustrated those emissions wrong. I calculated that wrong. You're probably going to want to go back and fix that, just so, you know, it's equivalent over time and you can really measure those reductions and see what your operations are doing. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I do want to highlight a couple different challenges as well as best practices when you're developing your inventory. Data collection can be a huge challenge, especially as you're first starting out. As you're starting to think about building your inventory, make a list of all the data you're going to need, see what you have available and what's, you know, going to be easy to collect, and then see what you don't collect already and what you're going to need to start implementing processes to collect. As far as best practices, we already talked about the principles that make up a successful inventory. So keep those in mind. It's really important to make sure that you're being super transparent and that you're documenting everything. You want to document assumptions. You want to document why you did things the way you did them, you know, why you included certain sources, why you use certain emission factors. You know, it helps to explain your inventory, and then it also helps, you know, in previous years, it might be somebody different in your company preparing your inventory, and they're going to want to know, like, well, how did they calculate this to begin with? You want to document how you collected all your data on all those methodologies. Here is just a list to help you when we pass out these slides later. It's just a couple different tools that can help with building your inventory, databases, emission factor databases, some like scope 3 models, some EPA guidance. There's a lot of good stuff in here. So I'll just leave that there. Okay, so next I'm going to show a couple of the tools that you can use to estimate your emissions, as well as go through a couple example calculations for some common sources of emissions. So first, I'm going to talk about the EPA Simplified Greenhouse Gas Calculator. This is a tool that can help you estimate your annual greenhouse gas emissions for any sort of US-based operations. So all the methodologies and default values provided are based on the most current from the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership Greenhouse Gas Inventory Guidance documents and EPA's Emission Factor Hub, which I will show you guys in a little bit. But the calculator will quantify your direct and indirect emissions from sources at an organization where activity data is entered into the whatever sections of the workbook apply. I'm actually going to stop sharing this slide for a sec, and I can just open that up to just show you. I'm not going to go through it in a ton of detail, but this is that tool. It's and it's an Excel spreadsheet. So there's a nice like introductory page that kind of gives you details on how the calculator works. and then there's a summary page that will sum up all your emissions for you. The blue is your direct emissions, scope 1 and 2, and then green will show scope 3 emissions, your indirect emissions. They have a boundary questions tab. Zoom in a little bit more. So it asks you questions like stationary combustion. Do you have facilities that burn fuels on site? If you say yes, then you know that you have to go to the stationary combustion tab and you enter information. The important information here is going to be what fuel you combust and what quantity gets combusted. And then the tool is going to know based on your answers what emission factors to use. It can go through mobile sources, refrigeration. There's quite a few sources on here. It does not cover everything, depending on what your business is. Like if you were, a complex industrial facility, an oil and gas facility, like this would not be useful for you because there's a lot of sources that aren't included. But for a simple like office building and, simple operations that just have, combustion, purchase electricity usage, and some scope 3 sources, like this is a perfectly good tool to use. I just, caution you, know your sources and make sure that there's not anything you need to report for that's not included on this tool because it doesn't have everything. But there are some good tabs, some like help tabs. It's got a tab full of emission factors. This all comes from EPA's emission factor hub, like I talked about. I'm going to show that a little bit later. I mean, some good help tabs to help you with data management and just, kind of explaining the emissions and where data comes from. Okay, I'm going to go back to this now. Oh. Okay, so another tool that you could use to get a quick initial look at your business emissions is Berkeley's Cool Calculator for businesses. They provide you with a checklist where you can enter data that's applicable to your operations, and then you can go in and enter your data verbatim from their checklist into their data entry spot by entering your basic information into this calculator, including energy use, travel information, purchases and spending. The calculator will estimate your greenhouse gas emissions, and it can also suggest actions that you can take to reduce them. Like EPA's calculator, it does not include all sources that are applicable to your operations. So I would really caution using this for a final inventory. It's a good initial screening. And again, if you've got a really simple business, emissions wise, it might be fine. It actually includes less sources than the simplified EPA calculator. For example, it doesn't include refrigerant emissions, whereas the EPA one does, and that's a common one that a lot of people will have. And so again, it's good for initial screening. All the major sources are included but just caution you to be aware with these tools that they might not include everything that you need to calculate for your specific emissions. And this is just a summary of kind of how it outputs your emissions for you in the tool. Now that we've talked about some of the tools available, I want to show a couple quick example calculations for some common sources of emissions. So we can start with scope 1. In this case, we'll do combustion of natural gas. Here you would take your annual natural gas usage for the given source that you're calculating emissions for, that you collected during your data calculation process, and you would multiply it by the emission factor for natural gas combustion. In this case, the emission factor is given in kilograms per million BTU. So you would then need to convert to metric tons. This particular emission factor, as well as a lot of others, comes from EPA's greenhouse gas emission factor hub that I was talking about. I did provide a little snippet of it here, but I'm actually, again, going to stop sharing real quick and I can just show you guys what that looks like. It's pretty much, it's got all kinds of information, like it's emission factors for all kinds of stationary combustion. They've got CO2, so they've got carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide for all kinds of petroleum products, We've got mobile sources on here as well. It's a really good database to use for emission factors. They've got a lot in here, and they update it at least annually. So, you know, as you're doing your inventory every year, check back and make sure that your emission factors are still relevant. I will say that a lot of these combustion factors I have not seen change since I've been doing this, but, you know, certain factors do, and you definitely want to make sure that you are checking back in and, you know, using the most up-to-date factors, because they do update that pretty frequently. Okay. So next we can look at an example calc for scope 2 emissions. Like we mentioned earlier, scope 2 emissions are emissions from purchased electricity. So here we can take our electricity usage and multiply it by a specific carbon dioxide intensity. And then again, since the intensity is in pounds per usage, we would then convert the pounds to metric tons. Typically you always present your emissions in metric tons for greenhouse gas inventories. So that's why we like to make sure everything is converted to that common metric. The emission factors used to calculate emissions from purchased electricity comes from EPA's eGrid database, which stands for Emissions and Generation Resource Integrated Database. eGrid's a comprehensive source of data on the environmental characteristics of almost all electric power generated in the United States. It's based on available plant-specific data for all generating power plants that provide power to the electric grid and also report to EPA, which is the majority of them. So theoretically, these emission intensities should decrease each year as our grid becomes cleaner. The particular factor I used in this example calculation is the most recent one for the RMPA eGrid region, which is where Colorado falls. So this is representative of Colorado's specific grid. And finally, we can look at an example calculation for potential scope 3 source. Here we can look at calculating carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from employee commuting. To calculate these, we want to take a look at the total employee annual commuting distance and then multiply it by the appropriate emission factor, and once again, convert to metric tons. So in order to estimate that employee commute distance, you can just, I mean, it's an estimate. You don't have to have your employees like record all the miles they drove each year. You can just multiply your total employee headcount by an average daily commute distance that you determine. And then again, by the number of days spent commuting in a year. And then in this case, the emission factor was selected based on gasoline combustion in passenger vehicles. So this emission factor was from Argonne National Labs, Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions and Energy Uses and Technologies model, also known as GREET. The GREET model is sponsored by the Department of Energy and it's free for anybody to use. It's super helpful in calculating fuel cycles from well to wheels. It's a very important tool for scope 3 calculations since a lot of this is, you know, transportation related. And it's also really great for if you're looking at life cycle analyses. Once you've calculated all of your individual greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, you will use global warming potentials to convert your emissions to carbon dioxide equivalent or CO2e. And so here are the values from some different IPCC reports. AR5 is what's typically used today. Again, this is something that's constantly getting updated and changing. So you're going to want to see what the most up-to-date is. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board recommends using the AR5 right now. EPA, however, still uses AR4, so it can get confusing. I like to recommend using AR5, especially if you're not subject to EPA reporting, because that's pretty much the standard that's being used. So global warming potentials were developed to allow comparisons of the global warming impacts of different gases. So specifically, it's a measure of how much energy the emissions of 1 ton of a greenhouse gas will absorb over a certain period of time relative to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So the larger the global warming potential, the more a given gas can warm the earth compared to carbon dioxide over that same period of time. So it's pretty much just allowing you to make apples to apples comparisons. And so you'll see most things like, people will report their gases separately, especially methane is often called out, but otherwise most people are reporting everything as a carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so you have now built your inventory, and so what's next? If you're going to report your emissions publicly, there's a few things to consider. You'll need to decide where you're going to disclose. Do you have a sustainability or corporate responsibility report that you want to put out? Are you going to publish them on your website, do some sort of press release? You want to be very detailed, like we've talked about what emissions are included, note any limitations or data gaps that might exist. This all comes back to that transparency principle we've been talking about. Pretty much, it's very important to consider why you want to report, who you're going to report to, and are you actually ready to report? I mean, that's a big one. There are a lot of reasons that you may want to work on reducing your emissions. Obviously, it's important to do our parts to reduce our carbon footprints for the planet. There are also business drivers to reductions. You have stakeholders or investors that might be pressuring you, local government, the community that you reside in. You may also have some overarching company sustainability program goals. You could be subject to regulation or have some sort of new supply chain mandates in place. You could also be evaluating climate change or economic risk reductions, like greenhouse gas emissions play a big role in that. There's voluntary drivers and regulatory drivers for your greenhouse gas inventory development and your potential disclosure and targets. As far as regulatory goes, there's EPA's mandatory reporting rule, which certain industries are subject to. You've got state rules, local initiatives, and you've also got the newly proposed SEC disclosure rules. For voluntary, you've got internal climate commitments or reduction targets and carbon risk assessments. I'm not sure if anybody here will be subject to this, but the SEC did recently propose a rule that I want to touch on. It would require certain carbon related disclosures in periodic reports such as 10Ks. These include the disclosure of greenhouse gases. The proposed rule is going to include scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosures and potentially scope 3 if it's deemed material. Materiality is up for debate for sure. Greenhouse gas intensities are also going to be required to be disclosed. And if a company sets a public climate related target or goal, they're going to be required to report information on this goal every year and in every report. They're going to have to report the scope of the activities and emissions covered in the target, the time frame for the target, and any relevant data to indicate that they're actually making progress towards their target. So the target's going to actually mean something. Additionally, they'll have to disclose if they're using carbon offsets or renewable energy credits in order to meet their goals, as opposed to just straight reductions. So now I want to talk a little bit about setting greenhouse gas reduction targets. Why do we care? If you've read the latest IPCC report, you know that we need to drastically reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions in order to keep the warming of the earth under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Here's just a few examples I pulled out of emissions reductions and targets in the news. It's like obviously a big hot topic right now. So we already talked about some of the drivers for creating a greenhouse gas inventory and disclosing that inventory. Here are some additional drivers for actually setting your reduction targets. Very similar to a lot of the drivers that we already talked about. You've got stakeholder and investor concerns, again, that comes up a lot, ESG concerns and opportunities, and also opportunities for sustainable business development. Okay, so setting your greenhouse gas targets. Now we can kind of briefly deconstruct building a greenhouse gas target. So you need to look at your scope, your mitigation strategies, and your time frame. So like, what is the scope of greenhouse gases you're going to look at? What is the scope of the activities you're going to look at? Are you going to just focus on scope 1? Are you going to include scope 2? Are you even going to include scope 3? How are you going to mitigate your emissions, and what is it going to cost you? Are you going to use carbon credits in order to meet your goals? Are you going to use renewable energy credits to offset those scope 2 emissions? What's the time frame? Are you setting a near-term 5-year goal? Are you setting a 30-year goal? Like maybe you're setting both. There's a ton of stuff to consider when you're setting a target, and you know, it requires a lot of thought and a lot of work. Once you have actually set your target, you're going to have to figure out how to tackle those emissions reductions. Here I've listed a few different options. You can make energy efficiency improvements. This can have a huge impact on scope 2 emissions and even end up saving money in the long run. You can look at fuel switching options, obviously the use of more renewable energy. Certain industries can look at carbon capture and storage and carbon sequestration as options. And then there is always, again, the purchasing of offsets and credits in the voluntary carbon markets. Okay, so here I just kind of wanted to show an example of a company that's already established a greenhouse gas target. It is a science-based target. This is Procter & Gamble's target to reach net zero by 2040. They set some initial goals that you can see here in 2010. I don't know if you can read them all on your screen, but they set goals to reduce their operational emissions, so scope 1, reduce their truck mileage. They also have additional goals in here related to sustainability and climate, such as reducing the use of their plastic through redesigning their plastic packaging. In 2021, they set some more ambition targets. And so they set a target to be carbon neutral in their operations by 2030. So this, again, targets their scope 1. Whenever you hear the word like operational emissions, that's normally referring to scope 1 emissions. They also plan to use 100% renewable energy by 2030. They're almost there. They're already purchasing 97% renewable energy. So very achievable target for them. And then they've got a target for their scope 3 emissions. A company like Procter & Gamble, so the net zero by 2040 is all scope 1, 2, and 3. So you know, a company like Procter & Gamble has huge supply chain emissions. I mean, they've got tons of companies out there, and supply chain is the majority of their emissions. So that's kind of hard to tackle because you don't necessarily have control over that. I mean, especially with their products, like how people use their products is mainly out of their control. They laid out a plan to kind of tackle that. And the interesting way they're doing that is they're doing some consumer education initiatives. So how they're trying to tackle that problem of how consumers use their product. In the case of Tide, they have a cold water washing campaign, which will help people reduce their energy usage when doing laundry. And so then that, you know, will help them reduce their scope 3 emissions, because our energy use as we use their Tide products in our laundry is their scope 3 emissions, which is kind of crazy to think about. But they obviously don't have control over supply chain emissions. So in the end, they will absolutely have to end up working with carbon credits to get net zero. There's just no way around that because they cannot control what people do with their products. They can try and educate, but they can't control it. So lastly, I just want to talk about some challenges and opportunities. So just like creating your actual inventory, setting targets presents both challenges and opportunities. Challenges include problems with interpreting commitments, lack of standardization of targets and commitments, especially across different industries. A lot of people will set scope 1 targets only, but then some people like Procter & Gamble are setting scope 1 through 3. So it's kind of hard to compare sometimes. So there's a big lack in standardization, trouble projecting your own company's business growth as you're setting targets. You know, mergers and acquisitions, anything like that can put a real damper on targets in the future for sure, and your long-term reduction planning. And again, transparency. You want to set achievable, transparent, and meaningful goals. Opportunities can include potential cost savings, you know, especially when you get down to that energy efficiency work, financial risk mitigation, and strengthening those stakeholder relationships, and also preparing for inevitable regulatory and policy changes. I mean, just like this new SEC rule that came out, you know, that's going to require a lot of people that hadn't been disclosing emissions, especially scope 3 emissions, because that's just a whole different thing. You know, they're going to have to, and it's good to get ahead of that. Yeah, so that's all I've got. Take any questions? Take any questions now, I guess.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat, Betsy. When we were looking at the EPA tool, there were a couple of questions there.
Okay.
Yeah, one was whether or not that tool breaks down by county.
No, that tool does not break down by location.
Mhm. Yeah, that's like a smaller business and a low emitter kind of footprint tool.
Mhm.
Another question is whether or not that tool works with the portfolio manager, EPA's portfolio manager. Again,
I am actually not sure about that. I have not, I mean, full disclosure, I have not used those tools a ton. A lot of the work that I do is for some more complex operations. So we are not really able to use those tools, and we kind of tend to build our own inventories. So I can check back on that though and get an answer for you.
Okay. And then Raina has a question. Do you want to unmute? And
Yeah, so I was just wondering in the conversation about setting targets, what kinds of science-based targets you would recommend based on like the most recent IPCC reports, and in terms of what's needed for mitigation of climate change specifically, what kinds of things you often recommend?
So I think the consensus with the latest IPCC report, Science-Based Target Initiative used to have kind of two tracks. They had a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree. They are no longer accepting the 2 degree scenario. So that has definitely changed the trajectory of the targets. And so I don't remember if it's net zero by 2040 or 2050. That's essentially complying with that science-based target. I'd have to look, but it's definitely by 2050 net zero in order to keep under that 1.5 degree scenario. And they have a Science-Based Target Initiative has sector specific guidance too for certain sectors. Like they have announced that they will not be doing a oil and gas science-based target. They will not be allowing it. They will not be putting out, I think they have some guidance on it, but they will not be putting out an actual standard. But for most industries, they have specific standards that you can look at that provides a lot of guidance and different options.
And does that help, Raina?
Yes, it does. And yeah, I think it is 2050.
Okay. Yeah. I couldn't remember with the, since they just changed it around, but.
And then there's one more question in the chat. What are the general guidelines for determining which calculation approach to use, which you've kind of touched on a little bit, where we don't work a lot in the space of the EPA tools?
Yeah, so I think I would start with I would start with the greenhouse gas protocol, and they have a lot of good guidance in there. And then I would look at EPA, because even if you're not subject to EPA reporting, a lot of your sources are going to be covered by EPA emission factors. So, I mean, say combustion, like combustion is going to be a huge source for a lot of people, whether it be like natural gas or diesel or anything like that. And EPA has emission factors for all of them. And so I would definitely start with an emission factor based approach. It's the easiest, it's the simplest. You can get more detailed and again, do your own kind of sampling, your own modeling for things. But I would start with emission factors. I would check EPA's database, because chances are they have the accurate emission factors in there. Like I said, combustion, any mobile source. So if you're looking at your vehicle fleets vehicle use for internal, like that's related to your operations. So people that are driving as a part of their job, that's your scope 1 emissions. People commuting, that's scope 3, because that's not a part of their job. So both are calculated the same way, but they're two different categories. You've got the GREET model, which I touched on for scope 3, which is like, if you ever want to go download it, it's free for everybody. It's like a huge beast of a spreadsheet, but it has like everything. It includes all of the EPA emission factors in it, I believe. But it's got all kinds of like transportation modeling done in there. It's got, I mean, any fuel you can imagine is included in that tool. So any sort of combustion, 100% between EPA and GREET has you covered. All of your scope 2 emissions, EPA is also going to have you covered because they have that eGrid database. You can get specific, sometimes power suppliers, like I think Excel does it, but I'm not sure. A lot of times your power supplier will have a specific emission factor for their specific emissions. So you can check on that. If you don't want to use eGrid's database, you might actually be able to get specific to your power provider emission factors. I'm not sure if that answered the question. I think I went off on a little tangent.
I'm not sure either, but you know. Again, you know, what I think is most important is that you're documenting why you chose what you chose, and you're being, you know, really honest about, you know, hey, you know, this is our first run at it, and so we had the capacity, you know, to work with Berkeley School Calculator, or you know, we decided to take a shot at using EPA's simplified tool. But, you know, this is the data we pulled, be very transparent about that, you know, and there's always uncertainty. And then as Betsy mentioned, next year, you're going to go back and revisit and you're going to say, oh, well, now we realize we didn't include this, or we shouldn't have, you know, applied this data in this way. And you can always go back and adjust and correct.
Yes, I work with all kinds of clients that, you know, I mean, I work with people that this is their 10th year doing their inventory, and I work with people that it's their first year putting together an inventory. And, you know, you're making improvements every year to data collection, to the way you calculate emissions, but especially for those first year people, like, you know, you probably weren't collecting a lot of the data before because you didn't realize you needed to, especially if it wasn't required by EPA or anybody else. So like, just, you know, there's a lot of assumptions to be made in that first inventory, and then just realize where you made those assumptions. Like we said, document everything, and then put some data procedures into place. So figure out, how are you going to collect that missing data? You know, how easy is it? Who do you have to talk to get that data? Like what kind of processes do you have to put in place to collect that data? Because, you know, you will eventually, once you realize those data gaps, you're going to try and, you know, fill as many of those gaps as possible. Like there will always be assumptions made, but limiting assumptions is a best practice for sure.
And that's all for the chat. So does anyone want to unmute and ask any questions?
Yeah, it looks like we have one. They're asking, is the EPA tool sufficient for a small nonprofit?
It should be. You know, my information's here. If you want to like reach out and kind of give me some information on your particular business, I can definitely, you know, guide you in the right direction as far as that. I'd have to look at what specific sources you have, but like a small office setting, absolutely.
Awesome. And then we have another one. So when determining scope and measurements, how do you deal with the issue of diminishing returns, especially with smaller organizations?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And that's why I think you're going to keep it as broad as possible to start with. And that's why, I mean, these tools are out here. Like I said, you don't need to be paying, you know, a consultant like me a bunch of money to be putting together a super detailed inventory for you, when you can start with tools like this, and they will be definitely sufficient to start with, especially for these small business where your footprint is really small, and you're just, you know, trying to quantify for the first time. So you definitely, like, you absolutely don't need to be putting in a bunch of money. Like I see the value where you want to begin putting in the money is if you determine that that you're setting a target and you need to make these kind of reductions. And that's more applicable to the big emitters than small people. But I think that's where you're going to run more into, you know, the economic benefits, is when you're actually putting in money to making the reductions, not necessarily quantifying your emissions. You should absolutely not be spending a ton of money just to quantify your emissions. There's the easy tools out there. EPA's emission factors, again, are okay to be used for a majority of sources. So it can be done in a cheap way.
Awesome. And we have another one. So if you can get your business to net zero by 2050, are you recommending going further? Net zero isn't actually the end, right?
That's a great
agreed.
question.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. And and again, like a lot of these companies that have been making net zero targets, they are 100% planning on using carbon credits. Like it's just, there's, especially if you're looking at scope 3, and it's understandable with scope 3 because a lot of that stuff is out of your control. But yeah, go net negative, and obviously net negative probably isn't available with true reductions because that, you'd have to be doing, carbon capture, carbon sequestration along with your actual reductions to get that negative, but you can absolutely go negative with purchasing carbon credits. And I don't think carbon credits are the end all be all. I think we should make as many actual reductions as possible. But again, in the end, that's not possible for everybody, especially with scope 3 emissions. It's frankly impossible. Suzanne, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think it's wonderful. And I think, as we find that these opportunities and just to capitalize on those and eventually make, net zero profitable, I think is a fantastic target.
Mm-hmm.
I did actually have a question tied to offsets specifically. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the quality of offsets that people should be looking for when they're looking at offsets and when offsets are appropriate. I think some people kind of opt into wind source as like a first go-to, and then they're like, oh, good, I'm done. And so I'm wondering how you approach that conversation and at what point you encourage offsets.
Yeah. So like I said, scope 3 emissions, you're going to need offsets. I think that, starting out, a lot of people are going to be using offsets until they figure out where they can make those meaningful reductions. Like a lot of companies, it's kind of crazy to me, have made like 2025 net zero targets. And, frankly, they don't have any idea how they're going to actually get there. And so they are relying on carbon credits. And ideally, they would kind of wean themselves off those credits as they're able to, make those actual reductions. And, obviously those actual reductions, like some of them might save money in the long run, but they are capital investments. They are going to cost money. I mean, at least up front. So it's kind of like a lot of that stuff does have to be phased in. You can't make all those reductions all at once. So I think it would be great if, these companies that are relying on credits were able to phase them out. I mean, to a point. Again, there's certain kinds of operations that, with the technology that's out there today, at least, like you cannot get to zero without credits. Unfortunately, it just is what it is. But hopefully in the future that changes. And as far as what kind of credits to use, this is not my area of expertise. My boss is actually an expert in credits, so I can, I can ping her for some information. She's worked with a lot of different companies, such as like Element Markets, and there's like a bunch of brokers out there, and a lot of the information is publicly available. You can go to their websites and look at their databases, and it'll show you what kind of projects they have going on, whether they're planting some forest land, and it'll tell you like over time what the negative emissions are from that project. There's I know like Louisiana's doing a bunch of like wetland projects, and there are some really cool projects out there. Again, it's not super my area of expertise, but I can definitely get some information on it and pass it along.
Are there any other questions? Feel free to send in the chat or unmute.
Real quick, I'm just curious if Betsy's done any auditing of cannabis facilities.
I have not.
Indoor cannabis facilities specifically, yeah.
I actually have never had the opportunity to do that, so I'm not familiar with it, but I would like to.
I have been in indoor cannabis facilities. What specifically, energy audit?
Energy audit and, carbon footprint audit, basically. Ideally just looking at a full sustainability audit, just curious because it's just very little public data basically to know how we're doing as a whole. So I'm in the cannabis industry and our focus is to get to net positive basically. So beyond net zero, like that other person was asking about. And so I'm talking to engineers and we're trying to, focus in on what's the low hanging fruit and, how far we'd have to design into it in order to kind of ensure getting to net positive. And just finding it hard to find comparisons like for the industry as a whole, because everything's very secretive and there's no, federal oversight.
Yeah, I could see how that would be really hard. I mean, again, not super familiar with everything, but off the top of my head, I would imagine scope 2 emissions are going to be a huge issue with the, huge amount of energy usage, when you're growing. But, renewable energy obviously would be a big thing for that, like purchasing renewable energy credits, generating your own renewable energy, either way to offset those scope 2 emissions. Because again, without having looked into it, I imagine that scope 2 emissions are the bulk of the issue.
Okay.
Energy efficiency, obviously, also, the less energy you have to use, the less emissions you're going to have related to your energy usage.
Yep.
I would broaden your benchmarking to be looking at the agricultural industry and then also the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. The agricultural industry, the outdoor growing, I suspect is a lot lower in general, but then it's probably going to get picked up in the transportation, right? Because they tend to be out in rural areas. And then you have the carbon footprint related to the shipping.
Yeah, so they're not going to have the scope 2 emissions. They're going to have a lot of those scope 1 emissions from the combustion of their mobile vehicles. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks.
All right, looks like we got one in the chat. So indoor cannabis cultivation facilities purchase CO2 to use while growing. What scope would this be calculated under?
That would be scope 1. It's used directly. Anything that's used directly on site for your direct operations is going to be scope 1.
So a related question to that, if you're capturing your CO2 from like a cogen or a quad gen, and you're using that to supplement your plants, does that have to be, how does that get factored in?
So if you are, that's a little more difficult, but that would be scope 1 emissions because any on-site power generation is scope 1.
Right, but the CO2 that's being generated by that on-site power generation is a byproduct that would normally getting vented. And if you're not purchasing CO2 to supplement your plants, but you're basically using the byproduct of your energy production to supplement your plants, then aren't you basically sequestering that CO2?
You are. So you would get the credit for sequestering that CO2 and you wouldn't have the emissions from venting it. You would, however, have the emissions from using it and combusting it as a fuel.
So primarily as creating the fuel, you get that, but then you'd also have the offset by sequestering the CO2.
Yeah, so you'd have to figure out what your net is there. It could be a benefit. It could be net emissions. I'd have to look at it to be sure.
Thanks.
All right, are there any other questions? All right, we got one in the chat. So do you have experience with hospitals or medical offices?
I don't in particular, but I believe some people on my team have some good experience with those kinds of things. They definitely have experience with industrial facilities. Hospitals specifically, I'd have to ask around, but I don't.
Right, I have experience with a medical device manufacturer and a medical waste treatment facility. And then we do have other people in our organization with experience at hospitals, universities, you know, those kinds of little mini cities. So.
And since my contact information is here, if you guys have any like specific questions like that, feel free to reach out. And again, we have a whole team over here with everybody's has different areas of specialty within the greenhouse gas, you know, sphere. So probably one way or the other, we could get your questions answered.
Awesome. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I think we will call it now. So thank you again, Betsy and Suzanne, for joining us and giving us that wonderful presentation. I hope it helped everybody in terms of greenhouse gas inventories and getting started on that. And then again, I'm going to send a link in the chat. If you guys would be able to fill out a short survey, that would be much appreciated. But yeah, so everyone have a wonderful day. And thank you again, Betsy and Suzanne.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks.
Really helpful.
If you don't mind making me host again, Betsy, that'd be
I know,
great.
I'm trying to figure out how.
No worries. I think, here, let me see if I can just reclaim it.
Okay, you
Okay,
did.
that works.
Cool.
Awesome. All right, perfect. So I recorded all
Form
this
can
too,
only be
so
filled out if you have permission.
what was that?
I tried to tag on the form and I got a message that said that the form can only
okay.
be filled out if you have
Yeah.
permissions.
Let me fix that. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, you should be good to go now.
Just get back there. You posted it just back in the chat?
Here, yeah.
I don't know why it still says I need permission. Let me close out of all these. Try again.
All right, did that work for you?
Not the last one that you posted, and it
Okay.
looks like someone else wrote didn't work in the chat as well.
Man.
Oh, yep. Tried it again. The last one worked.
Okay. This link should work, everybody. Sorry about that. All the permissions are opened now.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.